Hello, welcome to the WSET Bitesize series of webinars. And this is What is Sherry with myself, Lauren Denyer. Um, it is a great series of webinars that WSET are doing. So the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, so we are the world's leading provider of qualifications and courses in wine, spirits and sake. WSET has over 50 years experience in designing and delivering education to help wine professionals and consumers and enthusiasts around the world. So 70 countries with 800 course providers where you can do our courses. So if you're interested in finding out more, then please go and visit wsetglobal.com and you'll see that we have areas there where you can see what's coming up and providers around the world. So just to let you know that today this webinar will be recorded. It will be available to watch via the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. And if you would like to, during this webinar, post any questions you have in the Q&A box, and please feel free to write anything you'd like to write in the chat box as well, where you're dialing in from, and any just general comments. And at the end, we'll try and answer as many of your questions as possible. So I'm Lauren Denyer, very happy to be doing this webinar today. I'm a great sherry lover. I am in fact a certified sherry educator and sherry master. I teach sherry at all the levels for the WSET qualifications in wine. So I'm very pleased to be going through this presentation with you today. And like I said before, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to pop them in the Q&A area. So this is a beginner's webinar. So I expect that many of you are not so familiar with sherry, or just have a general curiosity about it and maybe don't fully understand this wonderful wine. But of course, I'm sure that many of you do already know a bit about it as well. So please ask any kinds of questions that you have, and I will do my best to answer them at whatever level they may be. No level is too beginner or too high enough, hopefully, for me to answer. So just a general introduction. Sherry is a fortified wine from Spain. So throughout this presentation, which should take around sort of 20-25 minutes, I will explain what fortification is. We'll look at the region of Jerez and what that means for this style of wine, the production methods of this style of wine, and we'll look at the specific styles as well. So it is a fortified wine. It is aged in the area of Jerez, as you can see on this map here. So down in Andalusia, right in the south of Spain. It is matured and blended using a Solara system. It's a very specific system to this part of the world. It is borrowed a little for other styles of alcoholic beverages, but I will talk more about the specificity of it in Jerez in a little bit later. And then it can be as a style made as a dry wine. So I would say it's probably one of the driest wines in the world. It can also make the sweetest wines in the world and pretty much anything in between. So we'll look at those very different styles in a bit, which is one of the glorious things about sherry. I do truly believe there is a sherry for everybody. Okay. So in Jerez itself, so Jerez, as I mentioned before, it's a region in Andalusia. So we're right down in the south of Spain, and we've got this amazing landscape and incredible soil type, which is very unique to this part of Spain. It is called the Albarriza soil. So if you can see on this photo, we've got this very white, chalky soil. So a lot of limestone in there. It is very white, very pale to look at. And when it rains, it goes quite grey. It's quite dusty, very, very chalky soil, so it's quite high sort of alkaline content, but it's brilliant for retaining water, which is really, really important in this part of the world. So it's an essential soil type. Without the Albarriza soil, we could not grow the grapes that we grow down here, and therefore we could not produce the style of wine that is produced, because it's very warm, 300 days of sunshine a year. So that means those other 65 days a year, you have rain or you have clouds. So you do get a fair amount of rain. So as you can see, 6,200 millimeters average rainfall in a year. And so that means it's enough rain, but it generally comes in the winter time. So it doesn't come throughout the hot summers so there is drought potential here. So we do need this soil type, which helps to lock in that water. And also, as this soil type is very good at preventing evaporation, there's a layer on the top which dries, and it stops any water underneath from coming out. So it retains that water, also retains general moisture in the air, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So yes, these very hot summers, which can get up to 40 degrees centigrade. And actually this year got even hotter than that. I think we know that it was a very hot summer in many parts of Europe. Mild winters, so around sort of 4 degrees upwards in the winter time. So the winter time generally being around the months from November to February. This makes Jerez a wonderful place to visit in the spring and in the autumn. So if you do want to visit, probably avoid summer, a little bit too hot. But if you're like me and you live in the UK, it's a great place to go in the spring and autumn time. So if it's a little bit too chilly in the UK, you're guaranteed some really nice weather in Jerez. So we've got these two prominent winds. These winds are extremely important for the environmental factors that we need for the growth of the grapes and for the production of the wine. So we've got the Poniente wine coming from the Atlantic from the west, and this is a cool and wet wind. So that brings with it the rainfall, but then and also some humidity. And then from the east, we've got the Levante, which is a much hotter wind. It's a drier wind. So the two meet around here, and so you get that pressure. So you get the rainfall and you get the moisture. But of course, if we just have one of those winds, it wouldn't work quite in the same way. But the two together are really important. And what they do is the bodegas, where they age the wines, and we'll look a little bit at that later, but they face the Atlantic. So the cooling winds can come into the bodegas nice and easily, and they act as a sort of natural air conditioning. Okay, so I'll move on. Just have a look at this map here. So here we've got the area of Jerez, and we've got a few key town cities here. So Jerez de la Frontera is our key city here, where there's a lot of bodegas, and these are aging bodegas. And then we've got a very important town here, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, because a particular style of sherry is aged there. That's Manzanilla. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then we've got Puerto de Santa Maria, which you can see just a little bit further to the south there. And so those are three of the main aging town cities for the wines. There are other towns as well which are permitted to age the wines. Okay, I can see we do have a question already, and I'll address that a little bit later. The fortification. So fortification, so the addition of alcohol to wine or fermenting wine. So in this case, when we're making a fortified wine, the wine can be, you can fortify it during the fermentation, and so that means that you will get a sweet style of wine. So most of the wines that are made for sherry wines, they are fortified after the fermentation. So you've got a dry wine, and then you add the spirit afterwards. So that means that most sherries are dry. The grape base spirit that's added is around 95 or 96% alcohol. So that means that you don't need to add very much. And it means that these wines tend to not taste too alcoholic. The lowest alcohol wines that we have for sherry around 15%. So they'll need to add from about 13% to the base wine, take it up to about 15%. And then some of the sherries that we have can be over 20%, so around 20, perhaps 21% in some cases. And that's due to a slightly higher fortification or to evaporation of alcohol, which I'll discuss a little bit later. So the levels of alcohol are often aligned to the styles of the wines. So as I've mentioned, sherry wines, alcohol is usually added after the fermentation to make a dry wine. And that makes it very different to most ports, because with most ports, you add the alcohol during the fermentation to make it sweet. There are some exceptions to that for sherry wines. So Pedro Xinenez sherry wines, they are always made in a sweet style, and they are fortified during fermentation, as well with muscatel, and we'll see that in just a moment. Okay, so here's just a little photo that I took when I was there. So flamenco is a big part of Andalusian culture and very much alive and kicking in Jerez. So if you do go to the region of Jerez, make sure you check out some flamenco. It might be dance, because dance is a form of flamenco, but it could be guitar, and well, there will be guitar for sure, and singing often as well. So it's just a beautiful movement of emotional, creative singing, music, and sometimes dance. Okay, so these are our grape varieties. So we have Palomino. It used to be referred to as Palomino Fino, but generally referred to as Palomino now. Pedro Xinenez and Moscatel. Now, Palomino is by far the most planted grape variety in the Jerez region. Palomino is known for sherry to make a generally fairly neutral base wine. Now, Palomino can make some very exciting wines if you're making dry, non-fortified wines, but generally for sherry wines, that isn't encouraged so much. It's usually the characteristics that we get for sherry wines are created through the maturation process. So Palomino, it will give you fairly sort of low acidity, fairly non-aromatic characteristics, but works very well for the maturation. And we'll talk about that maturation in a moment, because that's a very, very key point for the wines of Jerez. Pedro Xinenez. Now, Pedro Xinenez is actually only a little bit of it is actually grown in the Jerez region. So what happens is the wines come into Jerez and are aged in the Jerez region. So Pedro Xinenez, it's not quite as resistant to the mildews that Palomino is, because we've got a lot of humidity. So Palomino is quite resistant to those. Pedro Xinenez, not so much. So it tends to be grown further east where it's hotter, and they don't have so much of that humidity. And then the wines are aged in Jerez, because for sherry to be a sherry wine, the wine has to be aged for at least 2 years in the aging towns, of which I mentioned 3 before. So Pedro Xinenez is used to make sweet wine only. So what they do is when they harvest the grapes, they lay them on the ground in the very hot sun, and then they dry, they raisin, they look like raisins. Then the grapes get pressed, and then then the wine, when it's fermenting, it gets fortified during that fermentation. It would be a very sweet wine anyway, but it's an even sweeter wine because of that fortification during the fermentation. So it's always made into a sweet wine. So you can get 100% Pedro Xinenez wines, which will say on the label Pedro Xinenez, but it's also used as a sweetening component. So whereas Palomino will always make a dry wine initially, Pedro Xinenez will always make a sweet wine initially. You can add Pedro Xinenez to Palomino to make sweetened styles. Moscatel is grown in the sandy soil, so not the Albarita soils, and the sandy soils generally on the coastal areas. And this makes, again, sweet wines. So in a similar way to Pedro Xinenez, but not usually as sweet. And Moscatel will be labeled as Moscatel. So it's a varietal wine. It isn't blended back with Palomino at any point. So those are the 3 main styles, or not main styles, so the 3 grape varieties related to styles, but yeah, they can make very different wines. But also, as I've mentioned before, Palomino and Pedro Xinenez can be blended. Moscatel is a very aromatic grape variety, so if you do have a sweet Moscatel wine, it will have that slightly more sort of floral, orange peel, maybe grapey quality to it. Okay, so there are lots of styles, so I'll try not to confuse you, but we've already talked a little bit about the difference between the fact that we've got dry styles, sweet styles, and anything in between. Actually, this photo up here of these raisins, that is Pedro Xinenez. So Pedro Xinenez when it has been laid out to dry. So we've got our dry styles. So these dry styles are always Palomino. Okay, so Palomino only makes the dry, well, it makes, if it's a dry sherry, it's made from Palomino. So we've got Fino and Manzanilla. So Fino and Manzanilla, and I'm going to talk about the maturation method in a moment. These wines are made biologically aged. So if you get a Fino or Manzanilla, they look like the first couple of wines on this strip, this long sort of table of sherry wines here. So they look like the first 2, the kind of pale lemon appearance. So these are 100% biologically aged wines, and they will be around 15% alcohol. I'll talk about the flavors and the aromas that we get from those styles of wines in just a moment. Now, I've put here Passado and Posada because if you have a Fino Passado or a Manzanilla Posada, then those wines have been allowed to oxidize a little bit. So they'll be a little bit deeper in color and they have a little bit of a slightly nutty quality to them. So that word will indicate a slightly sort of richer, slightly more oxidative style of Fino and Manzanilla. Manzanilla is is basically a Fino. It's a biologically aged wine, but that must be aged in San Lucar de Barrameda. Amontillado is a wine that starts its life off as a Fino or a Manzanilla, so biologically aging, and then it goes into oxidative aging. So it will be either refortified, so to kill the yeast off, which I'll talk about in a moment, or the yeast will die naturally, but usually it's refortified, and then so it will be partially biologically aged, partially oxidatively aged. Palo Cortado is a wine that starts its life off as a Fino, but fails being a Fino, and so is generally oxidatively aged. So these are sort of lighter, oxidatively aged style of wines. And Oloroso is a wine that has been purely oxidatively aged. And in order to make sure it's purely oxidatively aged, when it is fortified to a higher level of alcohol, 17% alcohol, so that the floor, which we'll see in the next slide, completely dies. So those are our dry styles. I've got Anrama here as well, because Anrama means from the barrel, so taken out directly from the barrel. So you can have many styles as Anrama, so look out for that on the label. And that just means it's come straight from the barrel with minimal fining and filtering and in the bottle. So you might get a little bit if it's been aged under floor, such as the Fino or Manzanilla or Amontillado, you might get a little bit of a slightly yeastiness in the bottle, which gives it a bit of texture. So that's another style that you'll get of the main styles. A sweetened sherry is a sherry that has been sweetened either with grape juice, so what we might refer to as rectified concentrated grape must. So it's a very sweet, it's a sweetening agent. It's used for many things in winemaking. And that will usually be a more sort of entry-level, everyday style of sherry if you're adding that. And you can do that for cream medium and pale cream sherries. I'll talk about which one is which in a moment. A lot of the time, Pedro Xinenez is used as a sweetening component, which was mentioned on the previous slide when we looked at Pedro Xinenez. Now, a cream sherry is generally an Oloroso sherry, which has been sweetened. So an Oloroso sherry with some PX added to it would give you a nice, sweeter style of Oloroso. A medium sherry is an Amontillado or a Palo Cortado with a sweetening component. Again, probably if it's a better quality, it will have Pedro Xinenez added to it. And then pale cream is a very new style, actually, relatively. And that is a Fino, and that will be sweetened with rectified concentrated grape must or grape juice because it's pale. So if you added PX to it, that would change the color of it. So that is our pale cream style. So the reasons these have these English names is they were created for the Brits. So they're not styles that are traditionally associated with Spain. And then the fully sweet styles, as I mentioned before, Pedro Xinenez and Moscatel. And Pedro Xinenez can have 300 grams a litre of residual sugar, very, very, very sweet, or even more in some cases. So these are the sweetest styles of sherries out there. We've got, as I mentioned before, biologically aged styles, oxidatively aged styles, and biologically and oxidatively aged styles. So I said before about Fino Manzanilla being biologically aged, Amontillado being biologically and oxidatively aged, as is a touch Palo Cortado, and Oloroso being purely oxidatively aged. So we'll have a little look at that on the next slide. Okay, so with biologically aged wines, these wines are aged under floor. Floor is a carpet of yeast. We'll see that in a photo. Let me bring that up one moment. Oh, hang on. All right. So my photo doesn't appear to be here. So biologically aged. So what you have is you've got a barrel. The barrels are never full. So they're about 5, 6 full. The barrels are 600 litre barrels. And in these barrels, you'll have that gap. Now that gap there for a biologically aged wine, that means that the floor, which is this yeast strain, this yeast can consume oxygen. Okay, so it needs oxygen to survive. So it needs oxygen to survive. It needs alcohol in the wine to survive. If there's any sugars or any glycerin in the which gives the wine its viscosity, it will consume that too. So these are all the nutrients it needs, the oxygen it needs. Also, it needs the 15% alcohol to survive as well. So those are the things it needs, this layer of yeast. It looks a bit like a carpet, and it produces acetaldehydes and some carbon dioxide. Now, acetaldehydes, they give these really interesting flavors. So you get like bruised apple character. With these styles of wines, so this is Fino and Manzanilla, you will get kind of sea spray notes, yeasty notes because of the floor. So things like dough, marmite, or yeast extract, green olive, olive brine, things like that. Very, very sort of savory, umami characteristics. And these are dry wines, so they feel very dry, and they have these really interesting characteristics. So this is, so your Fino, your Manzanilla, and if you have an Amontillado, it should also have some of those characteristics because it's been aged biologically. For oxidative aging, you have a wine that again has that gap. So that means it's been sort of oxidized quite an extreme level. Because if you think about most wines, if you're putting it into a barrel, you don't want it to have that much oxygen influence. Otherwise, it will go very deep in color. If it's a white wine, it will go very pale in color if it's a red wine, and it will start getting lots of characteristics that take away from the fruit. Well, we don't want the fruit characteristics here. This is a wine that's made from Palomino for the most part. So we want, actually what we want is these extreme oxidative characteristics. So we will get things like caramel, toffee, nuts, raisins, all dried fruit, coffee notes. In some cases, you'll get a little bit of furniture polish or nail polish. So that's your sort of volatile acidity coming through. And with really old wines like this, you'll get this kind of leathery, earthy notes, and even sort of very, very intense sort of woody notes as well. So when these wines go through this process for perhaps 30 years, you're going to get a real concentration of alcohol, which is why we might get 20 or 21% alcohol with these wines. You concentrate the flavors, you concentrate the glycerin. So remember, if it's biologically aged, the glycerin is removed by the floor. But if it's oxidatively aged, that's not the case. So it concentrates, so do any remaining sugars, so do remaining acids. So the acidity levels are generally a bit higher with these wines. So what you end up with is a very, very, both styles really, both methods of maturation, you end up with incredibly complex wines for very different reasons. And this is why sherry is such a wonderful thing, because you get this amazing combination of flavors and aromas that you don't get from other wines. And if you're making a wine like an Amontillado, which goes through biological aging followed by oxidative aging, then you get some really interesting wines there. Okay, so this is the Solara system. So as you can see, these barrels are not full. So this one here, the change of color is indicating that we've got an oxidatively aged wine going through. So the Sobre tablet at the top, that is where you keep the newly fortified wine, and then you kind of see what happens. Okay, is this looking like it's building up a nice floor? Great, that will continue to be a Fino or Manzanilla. Okay, have we managed to successfully avoid floor? Brilliant, then that will be an Oloroso. It will start its journey. So all the sherries will start their journey either as a biologically aged sherry or a oxidatively aged sherry. The biologically aged sherries may just be biologically aged, or they may end up following that pathway to become an Amontillado or a Palo Cortado. So one of the ways that we can make sure that the floor doesn't die, because if you matured these wines statically, so a biologically aged wine, then the floor would eventually die because it is going to run out of nutrients. Because we do need to keep giving that wine nutrients. So the Solara system is a fractional blending system, which means that you're always taking wine out and replacing it with younger wine. So if you're doing that, you're always able to make sure that there's enough nutrients to sustain the floor. So that works for the biological aging. In this Solara system, as we can see, which looks more like oxidative aging, it's just blending over time. So we refer to these barrels as name. We give the the levels of the barrel's name. Now, the barrels with the oldest wines, which will be on the ground, that's the solera. So the solera word comes from the word suelo, so the ground in Spanish. So the solera at the bottom there, that has the oldest wines in it. Above that is the first criadera, and then above that is the second criadera. You can have, so it's just layers of barrels. You can go up to 10 plus criaderas, which will mean that you can get very old wines. Because if you take the wine out of the barrels, and then you replenish it, and you do that not very many times, or you don't take out very much wine, and you've got many levels, then you are going to end up with a wine that has an average age for a very long period. So as I've mentioned before, sort of 30 years. We have age indications for sherries. So we've got 12-year-old sherries, 15-year-old sherries, 20-year-old sherries, which are very old sherries, VOS, and 30-year-old sherries, which are very old rare sherries, VORS. So you can achieve that with a very extensive Solara system. So this whole system is called the Solara system, and it is a fractional blending system. So you're always blending, because what you'll do is you'll take out all the wines from a level of barrels, blend it, and then that will go into the level below to replenish what's been taken out as sherry. So as you can see, that will go out, that will be bottled, and then that will be replenished and continues to be replenished until the new wine goes in. So always blending, which means that sherry is a non-vintage product for the vast majority of sherries. So they'll just have that average age indication by having some sort of formula where they can work out how much they've taken out, how many times they've taken it out, and how many criaderas they have. So you can see this photo of a bodega here. So it's Bodega Tradición that I visited a few years ago. They use a very old-fashioned method, basically a pipe there to remove the wines and replenish. But you can see the barrels only go up 3 levels because we're in these massive bodegas which have very high ceilings usually, and they allow in the air. So from that from the poniente to cool down the bodega, because you can imagine the outside temperature can get quite hot. They'll pour water on the ground as well to help with humidity and help with cooling down. So these are no air conditioning is needed. Everything is done naturally. The windows will be facing the Atlantic to allow that in. They'll also make sure that they don't get too much sunlight and heat in, and they'll have blinds to avoid that too. So you've got three layers or levels of barrels here, but the rest of that Solara system might be in another part of the bodega there. So just continuing with younger wines perhaps. Okay, I hope that's clear. So sherry is a phenomenal wine for pairing with food because of the really extensive aging that it undergoes and the very complex compounds that you can get from biological aging or oxidatively aging. You get just a huge array of things. So you get, like I said before, there's kind of caramel, toffee, burnt sugar, nuttiness, dried fruit characteristics, but also you get the briny, bruised apple, olive, umami characteristics as well. And so if you think about that, there are some wonderful food pairings that you can do. So for example, sushi is a great food pairing because that is really umami, and it's very difficult to get wines where they're not ruined by umami flavors in food. So normally if you're having something like sushi, you might think about sake or beer, but sherry works really well. Fino and Manzanilla work really well. Where you've got caramelized food, so I've got some sort of brioche buns here with pulled pork and caramelized onions, you know, something like an amontillado or even an oloroso will work really well. It's a typical thing to have seafood with your Fino and Manzanilla. I think we've got some salmon here with a Fino and another style of fish here as well. So it's a brilliant food pairing wine, and there's been lots of studies in that. And apparently, sherry has more molecular compounds in common with food than than any other wine. So one of the ways to really get into sherry and to really enjoy it actually is to have some food with it. I think it's very difficult to have it by itself, particularly the dry styles. So I would encourage you, maybe if you are a little bit, maybe Fino and Manzanilla aren't your favorites, try it with some almonds, try it with some Serrano, maybe even some Iberico ham, and see and some olives, see how you get on there. So that's the general introduction there, what it is. I'm sure you've got a few questions. I can see that you have a few, so I'll be very happy to answer any that you have. So yeah, please let me know if you've got any questions. And I think we've got some here. So I think I have a typo with the average rainfall. I think we need to remove a 0. So thank you for that. Now, is Muscatel the same as Muscat of Alexandria? Yes, that is the Muscat of Alexandria Muscatel that is grown in Jerez. So that is the exact one. So thank you for that question. How would you pair the 4 styles of dry sherry? Okay, that's a very good question. So the 4 styles of dry sherry, well, what they say in Jerez is they say that you have, if it's, I think this is right, if it swims, it's Fino Manzanilla. If it flies, it's Amontillado or Palo Cortado. And if it walks, something with 4 legs, then it's Oloroso. So, I mean, if you're a vegetarian, clearly that's not going to work for you. But that's generally how you would pair the 4 styles. But I would say that, as I said before, the more complex it is, the more complex you generally want the food to be, as a general rule of thumb. And you can have you can have sherry with every single course. So when I've been to Jerez, I've thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be too much. But actually, it works really well. Like, you have a Fino Manzanilla with your starter, with your fish course maybe as well, or maybe an Onrama, and then perhaps you'll have your main with an Oloroso, and then you'll have sweet styles with cheese and with dessert. So favorite premium sherry, oh my goodness, I couldn't answer that. There's too many, but some of my favorite producers are Lustal, Tradicion, Valdespino, and Gonzalez Bias, Barbadillo, Hidalgo. I mean, there's so many. So on the brick scale, that's a very specific question. How does port versus Pedro Xinenez compare on the brick scale? All I'll tell you is that Pedro Xinenez is much sweeter than any port that you will have. Okay, method to use transfer wine between barrels. So that would be really kind of a basic sort of, in what we saw in the photo, a little metal pipe. But actually, most producers will use something called an octopus. So it's a tank that has pipes coming off of it, and what they do is they'll put those pipes into the barrels. They will bring out the wine, they will blend the wine in the tank, and then they will use those same pipes to move that wine into the criadera below. So I hope that answers that question. How is batch tracing done? Okay, well, there are definitely tests are done on barrels, because if one barrel is contaminated, it's going to contaminate the rest of them. So they do laboratory tests on barrels very regularly, as far as I'm aware. So in the Solara system, how old the casks at the bottom have to be? How long can they be used for? They can be used until they break. Basically, the older, the better. So found some bottles of unopened Fino. They look to be left for a few years. Will they still be good to drink? Oh, drink your Fino as soon as you can. Fino and Manzanillas are very fresh wines because they have been protected from oxygen. So as soon as they're bottled, really they should be drunk. They won't taste bad, but they won't be at their best if they've been opened for a while. Can I explain the meaning of almacenista? So an almacenista is a producer who doesn't sell their wines under their label. They will pass their wines on to a bigger bodega who will sell them under their label. Okay, so any other country, region in Spain or the world produces similar style of fortified wine? In Montilla, Moriles, over to the east, near Cordoba, they make styles of wines, but they don't always fortify them. And sherry can't be produced anywhere else because it's a protected denomination of origin. And the Solara system is generally used in Jerez, but I've seen it being borrowed in other places for a fractional blending, sometimes for spirits. And about harvest, it's not a late harvest. No, they don't dry the grapes on the vine for Pedro Xinenez, and they dry them out on the ground. Okay, so I think that's about it for questions. So I think there's a feedback poll if you would like to do that. And Madeira wines use Solara system. They don't use a Solara system for Madeira. They use a different system there. They do blend barrels together, but they don't do it as a fractional blending system. Any specific reason for Manzanilla maturation? Well, maturation it happens in San Luca de Barrameda. It's more humid there. The floor is thicker, so the wine is slightly lighter. So it's a slightly different style, which why it has its own name there. Okay. And when they press Palomino, the last press fraction they use to season the barrels. I suspect they might do that, but usually the barrels are seasoned with a wine. So I think that's I'm not 100% sure of all the answers of these, but there's some very, very good questions there. I don't think any of you are beginners somehow. Okay, well, I hope you learned a lot. I hope you'll continue to enjoy sherry. Maybe go away and try some of those pairings and some of the other styles you're less familiar with. But thank you for attending today. Thank you very much.